In this chapter, we're going to take what we've learned so far and apply it to international trade. We'll start with an introduction of some basic U.S. trade facts. Then we're going to use the production possibilities curve that we used in Chapter 1 and see what international trade looks like on the production possibility curve. Then we're going to look at some trade barriers, the case for protection, which would be why we would want to implement some barriers to trade, and then we'll take a look at some trade agreements and free trade zones at the end. Let's start with some basic trade facts about the U.S. There's two terms on here you do want to know. The first one is a trade deficit. When you see a trade deficit, it means that we're importing more than we're exporting. And that's true for goods in the U.S. Also, overall, if we include goods and services, we have a trade deficit. We import more than we export. A trade surplus means that we export more than we import, and this is true in the U.S. with services. So we tend to export a lot of services, specifically banking, technology, tourism counts as an export as well. A lot of people think that our largest trade partner is China, and we do trade a lot with China. Specifically, we import a lot of goods from China. But Canada is actually our largest trade partner. And the reason for that is because we're so close to each other. So it's very easy to trade with Canada. Some other things to know of our total output that we make, so the total goods and services that we make within the country, only 12% of those are going to be exported. The rest is used within the United States. The U.S. provides about 8.5% of the world's total exports. China's actually the country that exports the most. They provide 12% of the world's exports, and we're right behind them. And there's actually 8 countries, if you add them all up, provide about half of the world's exports. Here, we're looking at how much within the country, how much of a percentage of the total output that the country makes goes toward exports. So this is a different way to look at exports as opposed to the total amount of exports. It's the percent within the country. And I mentioned this on the last slide. In the U.S., exports are only about 12% of our total output, which puts us here. And you can see that in a lot of other countries around the world, they're smaller than we are, so they don't provide more total exports, but a lot of their countries' resources are going towards producing exports. So if you take a look at Belgium or the Netherlands, they're at over 80% of what they make in the country is exported. So this data right here gives you a better idea of how dependent a country is on international trade, where you can see that we are not nearly as dependent as other countries. And if you're curious, China isn't on here, but China only exports about 20% of their GDP, even though they make the most total of the world's exports. And that's because they're so large. Now we're going to take a look at how a country decides what to specialize in. That means they're going to focus on making that good, and then they're going to trade or export that good. We're going to get into the specifics here in a minute, but in general, it depends upon what types of resources that they have. So there's certain goods that require a lot of labor. This would be like making toys or making clothes. This is generally done in countries that have a lot of labor, like a lot of Central America, South America, Asia are making toys and clothes. There's also land-intensive goods. So think agriculture, like corn and soy. We have a lot of land here in the U.S., so we tend to export both of those, both corn and soy. And then there's capital-intensive goods. So capital-intensive goods, for instance, airplanes, chemicals, these are two of our large exports as well in the U.S. because we have a lot of capital in the U.S. to use. Now we're going to dig deeper into this idea of specializing and trading. And to do that, we're going to use the production possibility curve. So there's two different things that you're going to need to be able to understand and find from the information that you're giving. The first is absolute advantage. So absolute advantage means the country can produce more of the good with a given amount of resources than the other country can. So the nice thing about these problems is you're always going to be given two countries that have the exact same resources. So when you're looking for absolute advantage, then you're just looking for the country that's producing more of the good with their resources. So absolute advantage is very easy to find. The next thing that we're looking for is comparative advantage. So you want to remember comparative advantage is the country that can produce the good at the lower opportunity cost. Okay, so this is the key. We're going to actually be solving for the opportunity cost in the country, in both countries, and then whichever one has the lower opportunity cost has the comparative advantage. Now, the key to specializing in trading is comparative advantage. So the country with the lower opportunity cost, the country with the comparative advantage, is going to specialize in making that good. So it means they're going to make a lot of that good. If they completely specialize, then they're only going to make that good, and they're going to export that good. So all of those go together. Lowest opportunity cost, comparative advantage, specialization, and exporting all come from the same thing. Now, to start this example, you need to know some of the assumptions that we're making. First of all, we're making this very, very simple. So instead of looking at all of the countries and all the goods that they're making, we're only going to be looking at two countries that will trade with each other. In this example I'm about to show you, it's the US and Mexico. And those two countries are only going to be making two goods. So in the example, we're going to use vegetables and beef, and then we're going to see what happens when the US and Mexico trade with each other. So a key thing to note is the two countries have the same amount of resources. So we're assuming that the US and Mexico are similar, which in real life they're not, but in this case we're assuming that they both have the same amount of land, labor, and capital in the two countries. And that makes it very simple to find absolute advantage. So we're just simplifying all the way down to make the concepts easy to understand and the math very easy to do as well. So we're going to be using constant costs in each country. What that means is that our production possibility curve is not going to look bowed out or curved like it's supposed to. We're actually making the production possibility curve a straight line, and that makes it so that the opportunity cost does not change. And the reason why we're doing that, we're just starting at the very, very beginning basics. And I will talk to you a little bit later about what would happen in a country if the costs in the country were not constant, if we actually did have that curved production possibility curve. The other thing that you'll notice as we go along, we're actually going to be solving for the opportunity cost. They are going to be different between the two countries. Okay, so here's an example of a problem that you'll be working through. In this case, they're giving us the production possibility curve for two countries. Here's the US, and here is Mexico, and they're both making the same goods. So we have vegetables on one side and beef on the other side. So let's do a recap of the production possibility curve real quick. Notice first, it's a straight line. I will be calling it a curve, but in this case, because we simplified it, it's a straight line. Remember what the graph is showing us. So the end point is telling us, this point right here would be, if the US used all of their resources and only produced vegetables, they would be making 30 tons of vegetables and no beef at all. Or if they used all their resources to make beef, then they would end up here. They would have 30 beef and no vegetables at all. So in the country, they're not going to only want vegetables or only want beef. They're going to choose some point along their production possibility curve where they get a little bit of each. So for instance, at point A, then the US would be making 12 tons of vegetables and 18 tons of beef. In this chapter, we would call this the self-sufficiency output mix. That just means that the country has decided not to trade and they're choosing some point along their production possibility curve to produce. Over here, we have this same data for Mexico. So if Mexico uses all of their resources to produce vegetables, they would make 20 tons of vegetables. If they used all their resources to produce beef, they would make 10 tons of beef. And they're going to choose this self-sufficiency output mix where they have a little bit of both, 4 vegetables and 8 beef. So they'll be at point Z if they decide not to trade. The first thing we're going to be looking for is absolute advantage. Remember, absolute advantage is the country that can produce more of the good with their resources. So if you take a look at the graphs, you're just going to choose the country that can produce more. So with vegetables, the US can produce 30 and Mexico can only produce 20. So the US has absolute advantage in producing vegetables. And then take a look at beef. Who has absolute advantage in producing beef? Well, the US can produce 30. Mexico can only produce 10. So the US has absolute advantage in producing beef. So keep in mind, one country can have absolute advantage in producing both goods. The next thing that we're looking for is comparative advantage. So to find which country has comparative advantage, and that will tell us eventually what they will export, we have to find the opportunity cost, because comparative advantage is the country that can produce the good at a lower opportunity cost. We can solve for opportunity cost using the slope, but a lot of times in the homework and in an example that I'm going to give you to do later, you're not given the graphs. So without the graph, it's hard to find the slope. So I'm going to teach you a different way to do it. To solve for opportunity cost, what you want to do is take the two endpoints and set them equal to each other. So I'm going to take 30 vegetables equal to 30 beef. And it is helpful to not just write the numbers, but write down the good as well. The next thing that you'll do is you're going to divide by the number that they're asking you to solve for. So maybe it will ask you, what is the U.S. opportunity cost of producing 1 ton of beef? Or which country has comparative advantage in producing beef? That would mean we're going to divide both sides by this number that's in front of beef. So divide both sides by 30 and see what you get. So we would get 1 veggie equals 1 beef. And what that tells us is the opportunity cost of 1 beef is equal to 1 veggie. Remember, opportunity cost is the trade-off, or what we have to give up to get it. So the idea is, if the U.S. wants to make 1 more ton of beef, to do that, they would have to give up the opportunity to make 1 ton of veggies. Now we're going to do the exact same process with Mexico. Set the two endpoints equal to each other, and then divide by the number that's in front of beef. So our endpoints are 20 veggies equals to 10 beef, and then we're going to divide by the 10 here. So 2 veggies equals 1 beef. That means the opportunity cost of making 1 beef in Mexico is 2 veggies. If Mexico wants to make 1 more ton of beef, to do that, they have to give up the opportunity to make 2 tons of veggies. So we've solved for the opportunity cost in both countries of beef. Now we want to see who has comparative advantage. Well, comparative advantage is the one with the lower opportunity cost. So in the US, they only have to give up 1 ton of veggies, but in Mexico, they have to give up 2 tons of veggies. That means that the opportunity cost is lower in the US. So the US has comparative advantage in producing beef. That means the US is going to specialize in producing beef. They're only going to produce beef, and then they're going to export beef. So most of this slide we've talked about already, but the info is here for you to keep. The opportunity cost of 1 ton of beef in the U.S. was 1 pound of vegetables, but in Mexico was 2 pounds of vegetables. That means that the U.S. has the lower opportunity cost in making beef and has the comparative advantage in making beef. That means they will specialize and export beef. Now, this here is very helpful to know. A country cannot have comparative advantage in both goods. You can go back and run the math again and solve for the opportunity cost of vegetables instead, but you would find that Mexico has the lower opportunity cost in producing vegetables, and that means that Mexico has comparative advantage in producing vegetables. But instead of doing the math twice, if you find that one country has comparative advantage in one good, it means the other country has comparative advantage in the other good. Also, remember that that is not true with absolute advantage. The U.S. had absolute advantage in producing both goods. They're actually better at producing beef and vegetables, but if the countries specialize in trade, you're going to see that both countries are better off. If they specialize in the good, they have comparative advantage. This actually answers the question, how does the U.S. gain from trade when we're trading with a country like Cambodia, where we're better at producing the goods, but we can, when we trade with Cambodia, actually both countries are going to be better off. Once we've figured out what the two countries are going to produce and then export, then we need to know what the terms of trade will be. This is sort of like the price of the good, but instead of having a dollar value, we're going to be looking at the ratio that they trade one for the other. So beef will trade for one ton of beef will trade for 1.5 tons of vegetables. We'll see that in our example. How do we get to that answer? So this is called the terms of trade. It's the ratio at which they trade one product for the other product. And they're going to choose somewhere between the two opportunity costs. In real life, this is dependent upon supply and demand factors, and we're not looking at that graph right now. So we're just going to have a range, not a precise trade. So the range is going to be between the two opportunity costs. So we just solved for the opportunity cost in the U.S., where one beef, the opportunity cost was one vegetable. And in Mexico, the opportunity cost of one beef was 2 vegetables. So the terms of trade will be somewhere between the two. It doesn't have to be exactly between the two. Possibly they would trade one beef for 1.5 vegetables. But if it's anywhere between the two opportunity costs, the two countries will decide to trade and both countries will benefit from the trade. This chart uses the numbers from the example, and it shows how both countries can be better off when they trade. The total output is the greatest when each completely specializes in the good that they have comparative advantage, and then they trade. So this is what we're looking at here. So we have the two countries. This is the outputs before specialization. That was those points where when they decided they were not going to trade, the self-sufficiency output mix. So if they don't trade, then the U.S. will have 18 beef and 12 vegetables. Mexico will have 8 beef and 4 vegetables. So this is without trade. We're going to make them trade, and then we'll compare at the end, after they've traded, how much they have, and if they've gained from trade, if they're better off or worse off. This column is what it looks like when the country completely specializes. So we said the U.S. has comparative advantage in beef. If they completely specialize in beef, they're going to use all their resources to make beef, and no one in the country is going to be making vegetables. So they have 30 beef and no vegetables. And Mexico is going to completely specialize in vegetables because that's what they had the comparative advantage in. So they're going to be using all their resources to make vegetables and not be making any beef at all. So since they've completely specialized, now they're going to trade. And they're trading at that ratio we looked at on the last slide. So one beef trades for 1.5 vegetables, or in this case, they're trading 10 beef, so that would go for 15 vegetables. So the U.S. is going to take, of the 30 beef, They're going to export 10 beef, and this is what they're left with after they export. So now they have 20 beef left. In return for exporting 10 beef, they're going to receive 15 vegetables from Mexico. So they weren't making any vegetables, so they've got that 15 vegetables to use. And then in Mexico, they weren't making any beef, but they imported 10 beef from the US, so they have 10 beef to use and eat. And then they were making 20 vegetables. They're sending 15 of those vegetables to the US. So they're exporting 15 vegetables to the US. That leaves them with 5 vegetables. So let's compare. This is after they specialize in trade to over here where they were not trading. Notice the US went from 18 to 20 beef. So they've gained, this is what we call gains from trade. They've gained 2 beef. They started with 12 vegetables. Now that they're specializing in trading, they have 13 vegetables. So they have 3 more vegetables than they did before. So the US is definitely better off. They're getting more beef and more vegetables than when they were not trading. And the same thing happens in Mexico. They had 8 beef. Now they have 10. So they've gained 2 beef and they've gained 1 vegetable. So both countries have more beef and vegetables than they did before they were trading. So let's take a look and see what that looks like on the graph. So these are the same graphs we were looking at before. There was the production possibility curve in the US. This is their self-sufficiency point where they were not trading. And I've graphed the point where they are trading. So once they've specialized, they've traded, they end up at this point right here. So they're actually outside their production possibility curve. Remember in chapter 1, we called this unattainable. It's impossible for a country to get out to this point on their own. It's only possible to achieve this point if they specialize in trade. And the same thing happens in Mexico. If they did not trade, they would get stuck on their production possibility curve. But because they're specializing in trading, they end up at this point out here where they have more of both good. So the main takeaway from the production possibility curve is that there's a higher total output within the 2 countries. Both countries achieve a point they could not get at on their own. Both countries are better off when they specialize in trade. Now, this slide is giving you more gains from trade that we can see when 2 countries trade with each other. We've already seen the first one, higher total output. That's what we can see that from the production possibility curve. This happens because the countries are being more efficient about allocating their resources. So remember when we talked about the production possibility curve in chapter 1, an efficient point was somewhere on the line. So anywhere on the line would be most efficient. But when 2 countries work together, they can become even more efficient by letting the most efficient goods in one country that make the good where they have comparative advantage or the lowest opportunity cost. Same thing in the other country. So we're actually allocating resources even better when we work together. Another gain from trade is improved options. This means when you trade with other countries, you're actually able to get more goods than you could if you were just making goods within one country. Think about the millions and millions of goods that you can buy on Amazon. A lot of those are from all over the world. We would have much more limited options if we were only making things within the US. The next gain from trade is competition. So the more competitive the markets, then the better things work. And we'll have the opposite of this is called monopoly power. Monopoly power means there's only one seller or a few sellers, and they're able to raise the price and increase their own profits, and that's less efficient. So the more countries that are making the good, the more sellers there will be, the more competition there will be. This is a much better thing for society when there's more competition. The next gain from trade is a reduced threat of war. We've seen from the past that when countries trade with each other, they're much less likely to go to war with each other. And then the last one is higher quality products. So when we trade around the globe, then those countries that make the good the best can specialize in making that good. So we actually achieve higher quality products when we trade. Now, I want you to think here not about all the cheap goods that you get from China. You're getting a lower quality product when you pay much, much less. So I got a $10 Bluetooth speaker from China. It's not very good. That's a low quality product, but it's because I paid so little for it. What I want you to think here is like bananas. So I'm getting a much higher quality banana because I'm importing it from Costa Rica than if I tried to buy a banana that was produced in the US. There's a reason why we don't produce bananas in the US. Okay, so here's an example for you to try. This is using the production possibility curve comparative advantage analysis. Notice here that I'm not giving you the graphs, okay? And most of the time in the homework, you're not going to have the graphs either. So let me explain this chart to you right here. This chart is actually giving you the endpoints on the graph. So the key word here is or. So Jamaica and Norway have identical resources, so it's going to be very easy to find your absolute advantage. The table shows you the number of coolers or radios each country can produce. So if Norway produced only coolers, they could make 80 coolers and 0 radios. Or if they used all their resources and only produced radios, they would have 16 radios, but then they would have no coolers at all. So they could have 80 coolers or 16 radios. Or if they're not trading with Jamaica and they want that self-sufficiency output mix, maybe they could split their resources half and half, and they would have 40 coolers and 8 radios. That's a possibility as well. And then the same idea for Jamaica here. So what you're going to do is figure out which country has absolute advantage in producing coolers and then radios, and then solve for the opportunity cost, specifically of radios. So solve for opportunity cost of one radio in Norway and then in Jamaica, and you'll be able to find from the math that you do in part B and C, you can figure out which country has comparative advantage in producing radios. And then once you figure that out, it's very easy to figure out who has comparative advantage in making coolers without having to do the math again. Once you've figured out who has comparative advantage, remember they're going to specialize in that good and then export that good. Then decide what might be accepted terms of trade for one radio. So if they're going to trade, one country will trade one radio for how many coolers. Okay, so pause the video here, try this example, and then I will go through it. Okay, first question. Which country has absolute advantage in the production of coolers? So remember, absolute advantage is the country that can produce more with the same resources. So it tells us that Jamaica and Norway have identical resources. So you just want to look and see who can produce more. So Norway can produce more coolers. So Norway has absolute advantage in production of coolers. What about radios? Take a look at radios. Norway can produce 16. Jamaica can produce 14. So Norway can produce more. So Norway has absolute advantage in the production of radios also. So in this case, Norway can produce more coolers and more radios. Next question. What is Norway's opportunity cost of producing one radio? To solve for this, like I mentioned in the earlier slides, you want to set the two endpoints equal to each other. And that's what they're giving us in the chart. So just set equal 80 coolers and 16 radios. Now the next step is you need to make sure you're dividing by the correct number. If it's asking you to solve for the opportunity cost of producing one radio, it means we need to divide by the number that's in front of radios. So we're going to divide both sides by 16 and see what we get. So you should have gotten 5 coolers equals 1 radio. That means the opportunity cost of producing one radio in Norway is 5 coolers. If Norway wants to make one more radio, they have to give up the opportunity to make 5 coolers. So that's our opportunity cost. Now let's do the same thing with Jamaica. So set the two endpoints equal to each other, then divide by the number that's in front of radios. So 56 coolers equals 14 radios. We're going to divide both sides by 14, and we're going to get 4 coolers equals 1 radio. That means the opportunity cost of producing one radio in Jamaica is 4 coolers. If they want to make one more radio, they would have to give up the opportunity to make 4 coolers to do that. Next question. Which country has comparative advantage in producing radios? Well, we just solved for the opportunity cost of producing one radio in each country. Comparative advantage is the country with the lower opportunity cost. In Jamaica, they are giving up 4 coolers to produce one radio. In Norway, they have to give up the opportunity to make 5. So the opportunity cost in Jamaica is lower. That means that Jamaica has comparative advantage in producing radios. The next thing is, which country has comparative advantage in producing coolers? Well, to find that, we could go back and solve for the opportunity cost of producing one cooler, and then choose the country that has the lower opportunity cost of producing one cooler. Or, keep in mind that one country cannot have comparative advantage in producing both. If you go back and you did the math, you would see that this is true. If Jamaica has comparative advantage in producing radios, it means that Norway will have comparative advantage in producing coolers. Next question. What would be accepted terms of trade for one radio? So remember, the terms of trade means what are we going to trade, the ratio at which we're going to trade one good for the other. To find accepted terms of trade, you just want to look at the opportunity cost in each country, and the terms of trade will be between the two opportunity costs. So both countries, Jamaica and Norway, will agree to trade if one radio trades between 4 to 5 coolers, and that's your answer. We can also choose any number between the two. So one radio may trade for 4.2 coolers or 4.5 coolers. Just keep in mind that one radio will not trade for 4 coolers, or it won't trade for 5 coolers. It has to be a number somewhere between the two. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to this production possibility curve analysis is what would it look like if our production possibility curve was actually a curve and not a straight line, which is what it would look like in real life. So if we have trade with increasing costs, remember the law of increasing opportunity cost? That's why the production possibility curve is concave or curved. So if the production possibility curve was actually a curve, what that means that our resources are not perfectly suitable to doing one or the other. We can't use some of our resources that produce coolers to make radios instead. It just wouldn't work, or they wouldn't be very good at it. So because of that, what would happen when two countries trade is we wouldn't have complete specialization. So remember in our Mexico-US example, we said the US is only going to produce beef and no vegetables at all, or Mexico's only going to produce vegetables and no beef at all. Instead of that happening, then we'll have incomplete specialization. So when Mexico and the US decide to trade with each other, the US will produce more beef and less vegetables, and they will still be exporting beef, but they're going to be making some vegetables within the country. And then same thing with Mexico. They're going to focus on making vegetables and exporting vegetables, but they'll still make some beef within the country. And that's a little bit more realistic.